Just like my last video on Lake Lanier, this video contains matters that hit close to home. In fact, a major event at the center of this video occurred just about a year ago on the campus of Georgia Tech, a few miles from where I live here in the state of Georgia. As a former college athlete and former military officer, I've often conducted fitness tests and physical training right alongside my male counterparts. And while there were often 2 to 3 women who could outperform the males on any given day, no one in any of my units, or again when I was on the fields in college, could deny that men were able to carry more weight, they were able to run faster, and march longer than the women. And the women, like I said, because there was always 2 to 3 on any given day, who could outperform men, they were women who were among the top 10% when you're measuring for female athletic performance. So they were superstars. Folks you would expect, of course, to be in the Olympics, be playing D1, get scholarships like that. That's who they were. They were freaking good. And so after spending years researching and reading about the dialogue around transgender athletes' right to compete in their chosen gender category, I thought it was finally time to make a video on the information I've gathered. That's what's really brought me here, is based on my own experiences and all the conversation that's been in the news these days, should transgender athletes have the right to compete in their chosen category, or should we come up with some other third or new gender-neutral category in sports that can accommodate transgender athletes without discrimination? This video will specifically focus on the discussion around Lia Thomas, her place in women's swimming, and the ideas that have come about as a result of the conversation. So I appreciate you being here, walking with me through the dialogue, and let's get into it. Lia Thomas became the first trans student athlete to win the Division I National Championship and All-American titles in any sport after winning the women's 500-yard freestyle with a time of 4 minutes and 33.24 seconds at the 2002 NCAA D1 swimming finals. Olympic silver medalist Emma Wyatt was second with a time 1.75 seconds behind Thomas. After her 500-yard freestyle win, Thomas was required to talk to the media but only spoke to ESPN and opted out of the mandatory news conference. Thomas refused to face most media outlets given the intense debate over her participation in a female sport as a natural-born male. Shortly before the NCAA championships, Thomas told Sports Illustrated that she had initially put off hormone replacement therapy because she thought it would end her swimming career. Thomas believed the HRT would weaken her and increase recovery time after workouts. Thomas started feeling different in high school and came out as trans at the University of Pennsylvania. Thomas has said she started feeling off and disconnected from her body near the end of her time at Austin Westlake High School. Thomas wanted to compete against women, but she needed a year of HRT before gaining eligibility, according to NCAA rules. So Thomas initially joined the University of Pennsylvania men's swimming team and competed in races against other biological males. While attending UPenn, Thomas began researching the experience of trans women and got paired with a trans mentor who Thomas said helped her comprehend her emotions. In the summer between freshman and sophomore year, Thomas came out to her brother and parents who supported the transition. The effects of HRT on her body, Thomas said, showed she could no longer keep up with men athletes. As a member of multiple men's swimming teams, Thomas was an elite distance swimmer in high school and continued performing at a high level at UPenn. In the 2018-19 season as a swimmer on the men's team, Thomas earned second place in 3 Ivy Championship races and got close to swimming at the NCAA Championships. 2 years after starting HRT, she joined the women's team, stating that she'd shrunk about an inch and noticed fat redistribution around her body. Still, Thomas beat the competition easily when competing against women athletes, flaming discontent from fellow athletes, spectators, and some swim officials. A report by the Daily Mail claimed that some of Thomas's teammates also felt uncomfortable around Thomas in the locker room due to her male genitalia, citing the fact that Thomas is yet to undergo gender reassignment surgery. The women on the Princeton University swim team spoke of collective frustration edging into anger. They had watched Thomas win meet after meet, beating Olympians and breaking records. On January 9, 2022, the Princeton swim team met with Robin Harris, the executive director of the Ivy League Athletic Conference. During the meeting, the team detailed the biological advantages possessed by transgender women athletes. To ignore these, they said, was to undermine a half-century fight for female equality in sport. Before the meeting, the executive director had already declared her support for transgender athletes and denounced transphobia. In an interview, she said that she had replied that she would not change the rules mid-season. The Ivy League reaffirmed its unwavering commitment to providing an inclusive environment for all student athletes while condemning transphobia and discrimination in any form in a statement released at the beginning of 2022. In February 2022, a letter written on behalf of 16 members of the University of Pennsylvania swim team was sent to the university and the Ivy League asking that they not pursue legal action to challenge the NCAA's new transgender athlete participation policies. The new NCAA policy stated that transgender athletes would have mandatory testosterone testing starting with the 2022-2023 academic year, at the beginning of their season and again 6 months later. Additionally, they would need to be tested 4 weeks before championship selections. Since Thomas joined the UPenn women's swim team and began competing in women's swimming meets, there has been extensive debate and scrutiny about Thomas's right to compete against biological human females as a natural-born male, who didn't start hormone treatment until well after undergoing male puberty. Michael J. Joyner, a doctor at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, studies the physiology of male and female athletes and sees competitive swimming as a petri dish for testing how resilient traditional gender categories actually are. Dr. Joyner contends that since prepubescent girls grow faster than boys, they have a competitive advantage early on. But as puberty comes, any advantage girls used to have gets washed away, and in fact, you can plainly see the divergence as there are dramatic differences in performance. The records for elite adult male swimmers are on average 10% to 12% faster than the records of elite female swimmers, which are numbers that have been the same for decades. According to long-known biological statistics, men on average have broader shoulders, bigger hands, and longer torsos, and greater lung and heart capacity as well as denser muscles. Peer-reviewed studies show that even after testosterone suppression, top trans women athletes retain a substantial edge when swimming against top biological women. The editor-in-chief of Swimming World, John Lone, found that Thomas's time of 4 minutes 33.24 seconds in the 500-yard freestyle from her NCAA title swim was the fastest time in the nation by more than a second. Additionally, Thomas's difference from her personal best with the Penn's men's program was just 6%, as opposed to the typical 10 to 11% difference generally seen between men and women. Lone also cited the fact that in the 100 freestyle, Thomas's best time prior to her transition was 47.15 seconds, while at the NCAA championship, she posted a preliminary time in the event of 47.37 seconds. He believes these times reflect a minimal mitigation of male puberty advantage. Among men, Thomas is ranked 32nd in the 1,650-yard freestyle. Among women, Thomas ranked 8th and won a race this season by a margin of 38 seconds. Thomas ranked 65th in the men's 500-yard freestyle, but won the title as a member of the UPenn women's team. Joanna Harper, a competitive transgender woman runner who has studied elite transgender athletic performance, agreed that testosterone gives transgender women athletes some advantage, but also makes consideration for the emotional and psychological pressures on transgender athletes. Ann Postberg, a PhD and former pole vaulter who studies gender in athletes, sees notion of gender disadvantage in sports as rooted in culture and an outdated view of what women can achieve. Through research, he's found that policies to protect women in sports are developed through messy and often contentious processes that selectively draw from varying beliefs and cultural norms. Cynthia Millen, who has officiated for USA Swimming for 30 years, resigned in December 2001 in protest of Lia Thomas's participation in women's swimming. Millen pulled out of the 2022 U.S. Paralympic Swimming National Championship, sharing her thoughts in a letter to USA Swimming. In a letter, she expressed frustration that Thomas was allowed to swim as part of the University of Pennsylvania women's swim team. Millen said that if she officiated the meets Thomas swam at, she wouldn't allow Thomas to swim, saying it should be up to swimming authorities, not athletes, to decide who should be able to compete in certain competitions. In January 2022, Michael Phelps said, when asked about the topic, that there needs to be an even playing field within the sport. The editor of Swimming World likened Thomas to the doping-fueled athletes of East Germany and China from past Olympic Games. During the March 2022 NCAA Swimming Championships held at Georgia Tech, about a dozen protesters held signs outside the arena. Some carried banners in the stands which read "Save Women's Sports." Kathleen Stock, a British philosopher whose work is often grounded in her feminist and lesbian identity, has become a lightning rod because of her stance on transgender issues. She argues against the insistence that one's gender identity is all that matters and emphasizes the importance of the lived experience of being born a biological female. Stock also loudly advocates for free speech protection for people who want to disagree with current all-inclusive gender identity laws. After Thomas won the NCAA championship title, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis issued a proclamation declaring the second-place finisher, University of Virginia swimmer and Florida resident Emma Wyatt, was the rightful winner. DeSantis wrote in a tweet announcing the proclamation that allowing men to compete in women's sports, the NCAA is destroying opportunities for women, making a mockery of his championships, and perpetuating a fraud. DeSantis denounced Thomas and other transgender athletes for what he called robbing women and girls of achievements, awards, and scholarships. Of course, DeSantis doesn't have the power to declare or disqualify winners in college sports, so the gubernatorial proclamation was largely symbolic. The same week, DeSantis, who is also a 2024 presidential contender, signed the Parental Rights in Education Bill, also known by critics as the Don't Say Gay Bill, into law. The law specifically prohibits discussions about gender and sexuality in primary school classrooms. Republicans tout the law as a protection for parental rights, but its opponents say it leaves LGBTQ students in a vulnerable and unsafe position. Like DeSantis, Representative Lauren Boebert also led 21 members of Congress in introducing a House resolution on March 30th, 2022, honoring Wyatt as the rightful winner of the 2022 NCAA Division I Women's 500-yard freestyle. Sebastian Coe, head of World Athletics, the organization that governs track and field, claimed in early 2022 that the integrity and future of women's sport is at stake after Thomas won the NCAA championship. The World Athletics president also called on the International Olympic Committee to introduce regulations that can be applied across every sport and insisted that gender cannot trump biology. Mainstream media site The Hill sees the debate emerging as the latest flashpoint in the country's culture wars, with conservatives calling on transgender women to be banned from competing in women's sports. A Harvard Caps Harris poll survey released to The Hill in March 2022 found that 63% of Americans said gender transitioning athletes should not be allowed to take part in opposite-sex sporting events, while 37% said that they should be allowed to compete. The polling also showed stark partisan divides on the issue. 60% of Democrats and 20% of Republicans said they believe gender transitioning athletes should be allowed to participate in opposite-sex sporting events, while 40% of Democrats and 80% of Republicans said they should not be allowed. Among independents, 68% said they should not be allowed and 32% said that they should be. In early 2022, the American Principles Project, a group focused on advocating for conservative ideas and supporting conservative candidates, declared that it plans to be involved in Senate, House, and gubernatorial races and has raised $6 million to make women's sport a centerpiece of its messaging. After the 2022 season ended, the University of Pennsylvania faced criticism from professional athletes for nominating Thomas for the NCAA's 2022 Woman of the Year award. Karina Groff, an All-American female soccer player from MIT who majored in biological engineering, eventually won the title. Former UPenn women's college swimmer Paula Scanlon testified on July 27, 2023 in front of a House Judiciary Subcommittee on gender-affirming care for minors. Her testimony focused on what it was like to share a locker room with Thomas. Scanlon previously explained that UPenn's response to concerns from female swimmers was to offer psychological services to their athletes. When asked what the reaction was within the team to being offered essentially a form of therapy to deal with the administration's response, Scanlon said she and the others thought it was a very interesting move. It was something the team viewed as a form of re-education. When asked why she believed the university was more protective of Thomas's feelings than hers or her teammates, Scanlon explained that she believed political pressure and a desire to be seen as progressive outweighed those considerations. Scanlon also revealed during her testimony that she had been a victim of sexual assault, something which made her even more concerned about being forced to share a locker room with a biological male. When asked if she'd brought up the assault to the university and what their response had been, she said she had raised it to the coaches and other people in the athletic department. After the assault, she explained that she really struggled with mental health, even taking time away from swimming because of it. Even after telling UPenn's administration and the coaching staff about it, Scanlon felt that overall it was not really a consideration to them. While there was a gap between the assault and Thomas joining the women's team, she believed her specific history as a survivor of sexual assault took a backseat to appeasing Thomas's wishes. Scanlon revealed that there have already been personal consequences for her speaking out, saying she'd been sent numerous hate messages accusing her of wanting to kill trans people or ban trans people from playing sports. ESPN NFL host Sam Ponder praised Scanlon for speaking out and telling her story about what it was like sharing a locker room with a transgender woman. ESPN host Sage Still supported Ponder's comments. Former University of Kentucky swimmer Riley Gaines also testified before Congress during a House Homeland Security Committee hearing on left-wing organized violence. During her testimony, she detailed her experience at San Francisco State University, when transgender rights activists held her against her will for 3 hours and demanded a ransom for her release. The incident occurred when Gaines was visiting FSSU on April 6 at the invitation of Turning Point USA and the Leadership Institute to speak about the right of women to compete on a level playing field. She testified that the school administration knew she was coming and said she was told she would meet with campus police to discuss a security plan ahead of her talk, but the campus police never showed up. Gaines recalls that at the conclusion of her speech, protesters filled the rooms Gaines was in, raising fists and flickering the lights. Eventually, the room went dark and a woman grabbed Gaines, claimed she was with the campus police, and pulled Gaines towards the door of the dorm. Gaines testified that she didn't believe the woman was with police because she didn't have on a police or security uniform and she had a face covering on. Gaines says she insisted, but ultimately gave in to the woman's demands because she feared for her life. Gaines was then escorted to a stairwell that was blocked by protesters before she ended up barricaded in an offices with members of the campus police. Ultimately, the San Francisco Police Department responded to the incident and helped free Gaines. On August 1st, 2023, Oklahoma Governor Kevin Stitt, a Republican, signed the Women's Bill of Rights into law in a move blasted by some critics as sexist and transphobic. Stitt stated that the executive order will solidify distinctions between men and women based on sex and identify spaces in which they are to be kept separate, including locker rooms, restrooms, rape crisis centers, domestic violence shelters, and prisons, among others. Stitt has previously signed measures to prohibit transgender girls and women from playing on female sports teams and prevent transgender children from using school bathrooms that correspond to their gender identity. In addition to requiring state agencies and boards to define the words female and male to correspond with the person's sex assigned at birth, the executive order also includes definitions for the words man, boy, woman, girl, father, and mother. The order specifically defines a female as a person whose biological reproductive system is designed to produce ova, and a male as a person whose biological reproductive system is designed to fertilize the ova of a female. It also directs schools and other state agencies to use these definitions when collecting vital statistics and further directs schools to provide dedicated restrooms and locker room facilities for boys and girls respectively. These types of nuances in nomenclature have been contentious. Phrases such as biological woman and biological man might come into play when discussing rules about gender category in sports. Many trans rights activists say such expressions are transphobic and insist biology and gender identity are largely social constructs. On August 7, Governor Abbott, who opponents often call Hot Wheels, signed Texas Senate Bill 15, coined the Save Women's Sports Act, which prohibits transgender athletes from competing on college teams that match their gender identity. Building on legislation passed in Texas 2 years ago, it forces athletes to compete on teams on the basis of their biological sex, or the sex that was correctly stated on their birth certificate according to the text of the legislation. World Aquatics, the international governing body for swimming, recently announced a major change in its policies regarding transgender athletes amid ongoing debates surrounding fairness and inclusivity in sports. The new policy introduces an open category specifically designed for transgender swimmers. The organization first updated its policy for transgender athletes in June 2022 to ban any biological male athletes from competing in women's events unless they transition by the age of 12. The recent policy change was spurred by the IOC's guidelines and recommendations, which refrained from focusing on testosterone levels to determine eligibility. In November 2021, the IOC urged all international federations to develop their own sport-specific eligibility criteria for the women's competition category. The Union Cycliste Internationale announced in July 2023 that trans cyclists would now be banned from competing in all international women's events if they transition after male puberty. The decision followed a July 5th meeting when the cycling governing body found that the current state of scientific knowledge cannot guarantee physical advantages would be eliminated after undergoing hormone therapy treatments. As a solution, some spectators and experts have referenced golf, where in the amateur game, a less talented golfer can use a handicap, which removes strokes from their score when facing more talented golfers. If applied to swimming, the sport could let transgender women like Thomas swim in women's categories, but only after a panel of officials analyzed Thomas's race times and subtracted seconds from her competitors' results. Over the last few years, President Biden and LGBTQ advocacy groups have urged Congress to pass the Equality Act. The Equality Act would amend existing civil rights law, including the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Fair Housing Act, the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, and several laws regarding employment with the federal government to explicitly include sexual orientation and gender identity as protected characteristics. The legislation would also amend the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to prohibit discrimination in public spaces and services and federally funded programs on the basis of sex. Introduced as bills by Representative Mark Takano in the House and Senator Jeff Merkley in the Senate, the Equality Act has not been passed by either chamber of Congress. After graduating from UPenn in May 2022, Thomas has said she plans to attend law school and become a civil rights attorney. Thomas says she also has ambitions to compete beyond college, which could set her on a course to be at the 2024 Olympic Games in Paris as a member of the U.S. women's swimming team. So that's it. After hearing what's been going on in the fight around women's sports, all that I've just said in this video, the different pieces I put together, different sides of the argument, you may say, so to speak. Are you a part of the 60% who think it's unfair for transgender women to compete in women's sports categories and it should not happen? Or is it time for society to evolve and accommodate trans people within current gender categories? But that's what I got for now. Let me know what you think again in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. And tell me, what should I do a video on next? Until then, I'll talk to you next time. Bye.